He was 70 years old, a retired school teacher, just buying milk and bread. But minutes later, he was handcuffed, slammed against a grocery display, and arrested for a crime he didn't commit. What if I told you no one stepped in until his son, the U.S. Attorney General, got the call? This isn't just about one man. This is about how justice looks away, unless you force it to see. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It started as a breath of routine, a familiar dawn in the quiet suburb of Charleston. Walter Bennett, a 70-year-old retired high school biology teacher, adjusted his weathered baseball cap and shuffled out of his modest bungalow. The morning air was already warm, thick with the promise of summer. This errand was simple: get a gallon of milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread from Greenwood Grocery, just a 5-minute walk down the street. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet the day would unravel his life in the most unexpected way. Walter knew every sidewalk crack, each knobby-rooted stretch. He took these walks for exercise, for clarity, for the comforting rhythm of his steps. The neighborhood had changed over the years. The new coffee shop, sleek townhomes, businesses with tinted windows. But Walter remained constant, a familiar face to the neighborhood kids who once waved hello. They too had moved on, replaced by young professionals whose glances skimmed past him like passing clouds. Today, though, Walter told himself he'd make this trip brisk-focused, dismissing the heaviness he'd felt rising recently. His son Victor Bennett, now the U.S. Attorney General, had called late last night, apologizing for being too busy again. Walter smiled at the memory. How proud he still felt, hearing his son's authoritative voice, the son who had once raced home to report how many deer he'd glimpsed or what new dinosaur skeleton he'd read about. That boy was now one of the most powerful men in the country. Walter's chest swelled and cracked all at once at the thought the world had moved on, but at least he'd given it everything he had. Early morning sun painted golden patterns through the shade of longleaf pines. Walter paused to take it in, breathing deeply, despite the ache in his knees. He had lived here for most of his life, raised children with his wife in this very neighborhood. He remembered teaching Saturday science camps in his backyard, singing lullabies to baby Victor as the fireflies danced. He remembered Sunday pancakes, the kitchen walls echoing laughter. There were scars too sadness loss, but he carried them like names, written in a cherished journal, part of who he was. Today, though, he just needed milk and bread. Greenwood Grocery was just ahead, tucked between a new bike shop and a frozen yogurt bar. A hand-lettered sign boasted local, fresh, friendly. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed like a collective sigh. The floor tiles gleamed too bright, too clean. He trudged past produce bins and cereal aisles. There was comfort there, an echo of simpler days. And then he felt it, a surge of adrenaline, a dull churning in his gut. 2 aisles over, he spotted a younger man, hooded, moving with swift, furtive motions. One by one, boxes of granola bars vanished into his jacket. A siren of guilt, silent in his wake. The man glanced around quick, as a cat sensing danger, and bolted. At that moment, the store's electronic alarm shrieked. It pierced the silence a bell-tolling trouble. Walter froze. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just shopping. Yet instinctively, he flicked his gaze toward the exit. But the thief was gone, swallowed by the morning street. And then he heard it, a voice behind him. "Sir, step aside." It was not a calm, polite request. It was not a question. It was a command, a blunt assertion of authority. Walter turned. A man in a navy blue polo shirt stood less than 2 feet away. His arms were thick. A badge flashed on his waist. He was off duty, or so Walter guessed, but he carried the power of a uniform. The man's eyes were cold, unwavering. Walter instinctively lifted his hands. I, I didn't see anything." He shook his head. "I just came in for milk." His voice trembled more from shock than age. The store clerk, Mike Caldwell, looked torn. Behind the counter, Mike held the register. But he said nothing. He watched silently, eyes flicking between the police-like figure and Walter's frightened face. Walter swallowed hard. Can you check the cameras? Please, I didn't take anything." His words were sharp pleading. The off-duty officer stepped forward. "Empty your pockets," he ordered. Walter's breath caught. "Sir, I don't," he managed. But the man's hand clamped on his frail arm. The pressure was enough to steal the breath. Now, Walter's purse, an old leather pouch, sat against his hip. His palm curved tenderness around its strap. He didn't want to raise pieces of himself silver locket mints a withdrawal slip from the bank, but he would comply. He slipped his hand inside. A single bill, a grocery list. The metal of the off-duty officer's grip seemed to shift, tightening the moment Walter's hand emerged. His shopping basket swung to the ground with a thud, half-lit bread loaf rolling. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the store, and then a pair of cuffs, the cold clamp of metal around his wrists. Walter's breath came in ragged little gulps. "Stop," he whispered. "I didn't." But the off-duty man didn't wait. He twisted Walter around, forced him against the display rack. The older man's bones cracked under the weight of fear. In the silence that followed, none moved. No clerk, no customer, no staff. Phones came out not to record, but to look on in passive distance. The lights above seemed to dim. The moment hung distorted. Walter felt stripped of more than freedom. Quiet dignity had been violently unmade, dried milk, scattered bread, and a broken body carrying the evidence. If dignity were a photograph, he had just watched someone tear it to shreds. In that moment, he clenched his teeth. Not from pain, but shock. No one said his name. No one stood by. He wondered even as fear tried to fill him where his son was. Was Victor aware of how fragile this system could be? Had he ever felt the sting of being suspected without evidence? Would he know what to do if he knew? But Walter told himself not now. Tonight, this wouldn't be about power. It had to be about truth. The ride to the station was silent. Walter sat in the back seat of a police cruiser not even half full. His wrists bit into his skin. Through the window, the world continued: cars, honking kids heading to school, a jogger passing by without a glance. He tried to feel invisible. He tried to remind himself, soon this would be over. Soon he hoped someone would see. And if they didn't, he still had to stand upright, even if he couldn't stand at all. In the cold, sterile glare of the booking room, time lost shape. He could feel each second as it passed: 5, 10, 15. Everything was blurred. The questions, the paperwork, the cell doors sliding shut. He was the only one who didn't belong there. But there he was, labeled processed, moved like a file. Night closed in around him, but the crackling buzz of injustice filled his veins sharper than any neon bulb. That's where we'll leave him alone, cuffed in a stark holding cell, the walls closing in hands, wrapped in plastic zip ties, a shell of the man who walked in to buy groceries. He was arrested for a crime uncommitted, and nobody moved. Because sometimes justice isn't ancient and blind, it's indifferent. But this time, Walter Bennett wouldn't stay silent, and neither can we. The metallic echo of the cell door clanging shut behind Walter Bennett reverberated like a gavel striking the emptiest courtroom. The holding cell was dim, its walls aged and scarred with etchings of forgotten names, rage, and pleas. He sat on a bench of cold, unforgiving concrete. The space around him was still yet heavy with unspoken stories, discarded humanity, and bureaucratic apathy. Walter had never been arrested. He'd taught students about biology, about order and reason. Now, he found himself processed like a broken cog in a machine that didn't care if it had misfired. The young officer who escorted him earlier had eyes that didn't meet his. They darted with discomfort, not malice. That scared Walter more. It wasn't hatred that placed him here. It was indifference. He replayed the arrest over and over. The alarm, the accusation, the silence from the store clerk, Mike, the same man he had once given a letter of recommendation to for college. Mike had seen the real thief. He had seen Walter do nothing, but he had also seen the badge, and with it, the ease of surrender. Inside the precinct, the officers worked like gears in a factory. Clipboards shuffled, phones rang, laughter drifted from a break room. Not one face showed concern about the elderly black man sitting alone in a cell. Walter had asked once twice for the footage to be checked. He had asked for someone to just look. They didn't need to believe him. They only needed to care enough to verify. But none did. Instead, Sergeant Rollins, a man with a graying mustache and the authority of years behind him, scribbled a few words on a clipboard and walked away without even glancing at Walter. Caught near the scene, he muttered to an officer, "Probable cause?" That phrase echoed in Walter's mind. Probable cause, a term once studied by his son in law school. It now wrapped around Walter's fate like a noose. Not truth, not evidence, just proximity and prejudice. In the far corner of the holding cell, a young man sat quietly, his hoodie pulled low. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the floor, as if the tiles could tell a better story than the people around him. Walter wondered if that boy had also asked to be seen and been denied. Hours passed. The ache in Walter's back screamed louder than the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. He thought of Victor, not the Attorney General, but the boy who used to sleep with his arm around a worn-out dinosaur plushie. The boy who once said, "I'll change things, Dad. I'll make sure people like us don't have to beg to be heard." Walter had smiled then. But now, sitting in a jail cell, for a crime he didn't commit, he wasn't sure change had ever arrived. Victor had risen through the ranks of justice, but had justice risen with him? Eventually, a clerk approached. A woman barely in her 20s, with tired eyes and chipped purple nail polish. "Name?" she asked. "Walter Bennett," he replied, voice low. She typed quickly, not looking up. "One phone call. Keep it short." She walked him to a mounted phone. Walter's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the receiver. He hesitated before dialing. Victor's personal line. He still remembered the number muscle memory born of years of love and absence. The phone rang once, twice. Then, "This is Victor Bennett. Leave a message." Walter didn't speak. He couldn't. He hung up slowly and turned back to the bench. Somewhere, a conversation about his future was already unfolding without him. A bail figure being suggested, a form being filed, a signature being forged in silence. He thought of the courtroom, of how it would feel to sit in a defendant's chair labeled an accused. He had raised a son who prosecuted injustice. Would that same justice rise to defend its own blood? When he was escorted back to the cell, Walter felt something shift. Not despair, but resolve. They had mistaken his silence for surrender. They had overlooked him because they assumed he would vanish into the system without a sound. But he would not vanish. The system was built to move fast, to process lives like paperwork. But Walter would slow it down. He would force it to see, even if he was the only one still looking. Victor Bennett was in a meeting with top advisors when his phone buzzed a second time. At first he ignored it. The U.S. Attorney General was not afforded the luxury of personal distractions during national briefings. But something, a pulse, a whisper, urged him to glance down. The name Dad blinked on the screen. He excused himself with a quiet nod, stepping into the hallway and answering on the third ring. Dad. His voice carried the warmth of familiarity, sharpened now with concern. There was silence. Victor's fingers clenched around the phone. Dad, are you okay? When Walter finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, restrained by the weight of 1,000 humiliations. Victor, they arrested me. The words hit Victor like a blow to the chest. What, who, where are you? Walter exhaled slow and steady. Mike's Market. They said I stole something. They didn't check the cameras. They just took me. The air thickened between them. Victor's world, often so measured and strategic, was suddenly raw and personal. You didn't call me earlier, Victor said quietly. I didn't want to, Walter admitted. Not unless I had no choice. But now I do. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded with memory. With childhood mornings, when Walter made breakfast before Victor's school debates. With nights spent pacing the floor during election seasons. With the quiet kind of love that didn't ask for recognition, but had earned every ounce of it. Victor didn't hesitate. I'm on my way. As soon as he arrived at the precinct, the energy shifted. The officers stiffened. Their chatter died down. Few had seen Victor Bennett in person. Fewer still expected him to storm a local police department on a weekday. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His suit, his badge, his name. They all spoke louder than a protest ever could. I want to see my father, he told the desk sergeant. There was resistance at first. Paperwork. Protocol. But it crumbled under the weight of his authority. Walter sat quietly in the holding cell when the door opened and Victor stepped through. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Father and son. Dignity and power. Wounded and weaponized. Victor didn't speak right away. He walked over and placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. I've got you. Walter nodded once, but there was no relief in his eyes. Only the pain of knowing what had brought them here. I'll get you out, Victor said, but not just that. I'll make them see. Within hours, Victor had filed for a court hearing. His legal team, swift and relentless, combed through arrest reports, clerk logs, and most importantly, security footage. They found the tape. It had never been lost, just conveniently ignored. The footage told a different story. It showed a young man head down, stealing from the shelves. It showed Walter on the opposite aisle, too slow, too distracted by the milk in his hand to even notice. It showed a confrontation devoid of evidence, driven by assumption. When Victor stood before the judge and played the footage, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Walter, sitting at the defense table, didn't move. He didn't need to. The truth was moving for him now. The prosecutor paled. The arresting officer wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. And Judge Ellison, who had presided over dozens of similar cases, finally looked at Walter as more than a docket number. Victor didn't gloat. He didn't rage. He simply said, "This is why people don't trust the system. Because the system doesn't always care to be right. It only cares to be quick." The charges were dropped, but Walter didn't smile. Later, as they sat outside the courthouse beneath the fading sun, Victor asked, "Did I do enough?" Walter was quiet. Then he said, "You used your power for justice, but it should never have taken power to find it." Victor looked away, ashamed, not because he hadn't acted, but because he knew deep down that his father was right. Walter turned to him. "Don't let it stop here. Don't let my story be another headline. Let it be a warning and a promise." Victor nodded. "I won't." And with that, a father's plea had become a son's purpose. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet tension, thick like storm clouds just waiting to break. Walter Bennett sat rigid at the defendant's table, wrists bruised from hours in zip ties, his back straightened not from comfort, but sheer resolve. His son, Victor Bennett, the Attorney General of the United States, stood just behind him, imposing, measured a force that carried gravity with every breath. Judge Ellison glanced up from his bench. "Are we prepared to present the evidence?" The prosecutor, a man whose confidence had dripped like oil in the earlier proceedings, now shifted uneasily. "Yes, Your Honor," he muttered. His fingers hesitated at the laptop as he connected it to the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered. The room fell into a silence so thick, even the air dared not move. On the screen, grainy black and white footage sprang to life. It began like any mundane afternoon. A slow-moving man entered the frame. Walter Bennett, dressed in his modest summer clothes hat, tipped respectfully low shopping basket dangling from one arm. He walked with care. No rush, no nervous glances, no pocketed items. He was there for milk and bread. That was it. Then from the edge of the frame, another figure. A younger man in a gray hoodie darted into view. His movements were sharp, practiced. In seconds, he'd grabbed snacks off the shelf, stuffing them into his sweatshirt, with a speed that spoke of experience, not desperation. And then he was gone, bolting out the front door. The footage clearly showed Walter flinch at the alarm that followed. He turned confused, but calm, still holding his basket. He did not run. He did not hide. He did not move. And yet what came next had changed the trajectory of his life. The arresting officer burst into the frame, not toward the door, not after the thief. No. He went straight to Walter. There was no hesitation, no conversation. Just swift hands on elderly arms, a rough twist and handcuffs snapping shut around the wrists of a man who had lived 70 years with dignity, only to be reduced in that moment to a suspect without cause. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. The footage ended. No one spoke. Walter didn't move. He sat, as he always had, composed, quiet eyes forward. But his fingers gripped the table's edge now, because that video was never meant to be his only defense. That video should never have had to exist. Judge Ellison took off his glasses and looked down, as if the weight of what he'd just seen bore into his very soul. Victor took one slow step forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but thunderous. "My father didn't ask for special treatment. He asked for justice." And if I weren't standing here today in this courtroom, if my title weren't plastered across headlines, he would still be sitting in a cell, stripped of his freedom and his dignity for a crime he did not commit. He paused. The room hung on his every word. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision, made in a split second, made without evidence, made because of who my father is, or more importantly, who this system assumed he was. The prosecutor shifted his face pale. Your Honor, silenced Judge Ellison snapped sharper than before. You told this court there was no footage, that the cameras were malfunctioning. The prosecutor's lips parted then closed. He looked down. Ellison continued. The court finds this a severe misrepresentation of fact. Charges against Mr. Bennett are dismissed effective immediately. A gavel strike. Case dismissed. But Walter didn't feel relief. He didn't even feel vindicated. He felt tired, as if justice had to crawl uphill, dragging itself through lies, ignorance, and indifference just to reach the truth it should have had from the start. Reporters swarmed as Walter exited the courthouse. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Microphones shoved forward. Mr. Bennett, do you feel justice was served? Victor, are you pursuing disciplinary action against the officers? Do you think this would have ended differently if your father wasn't your father? Victor put an arm protectively around his father. No comment, he said, ushering Walter to the car. That night, the footage aired nationwide. It lit a fire. News anchors dissected the injustice frame by frame. Opinion pieces flooded social media. Civil rights groups called for investigations. Officers involved were placed under review. Judge Ellison, once stoic, was now under the public microscope. The system had been caught red-handed, and the country was watching. But none of that changed the bruises on Walter's wrists. None of it erased the humiliation of being pulled from a grocery store in handcuffs. None of it undid the fact that if Victor hadn't answered that phone, the footage might have stayed buried, and Walter would have been buried by the system instead. Later that evening, in the quiet of his small living room, Walter sat by the window, untouched cup of tea growing cold beside him. The city sparkled outside. Victor stood across from him, tie-loosened eyes heavy. I won't let this happen again, Victor said. Walter didn't answer. He just nodded. Because what had happened wasn't new. It had happened in silence to too many others, too many times. But this time, the world had seen it, and the footage had changed everything. Walter Bennett sat by the window of his modest home in Savannah, watching the early morning sun filter through lace curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It had been a week since the courtroom erupted into stunned silence, a week since his name had shifted from accused to exonerated. And yet, the weight that hung in his chest hadn't lifted. Because justice had come, but only after a storm, only after his son Victor Bennett had walked through those courtroom doors with the power of his title echoing in every step. He sipped his coffee, slowly letting the bitter warmth remind him that he was still here, still present, still standing. But inside, a question gnawed at him, one he hadn't spoken aloud. Was what happened in that courtroom justice or privilege? The world now knew his story. The footage had gone viral, becoming a symbol for the many whose voices had been drowned by a system that judged before it listened. Across the country, protests ignited. Commentators, politicians, and citizens debated not just what happened to Walter, but why it took the intervention of the U.S. Attorney General for the truth to be heard. That truth stung more than the arrest, because Walter had not been seen as a man that day in the grocery store, not as a grandfather, not as a retired teacher who had built a life of quiet dignity. He had been reduced to a profile, a statistic, and if not for the accident of having a powerful son, he would still be just another forgotten name on a docket. Victor arrived later that afternoon. No suit today, just jeans, a plain t-shirt, and tired eyes that betrayed the emotional toll he carried. He didn't speak at first. He just sat across from his father, both men silent as the clock ticked above them. Finally, Walter spoke. "They didn't free me because I was innocent. They freed me because you were my son." Victor didn't answer immediately. He stared at his hands, fingers interlaced. "I know." Walter's voice was low, unwavering. "That's not justice. That's a favor." Victor looked up, his jaw tense. "It was wrong what they did. I couldn't let them bury you. I had to use what I have." Walter nodded slowly. "And I'm grateful. Don't mistake me. But what about the ones who don't have a Victor Bennett in their corner? What about them?" It was a question Victor had asked himself 1,000 times since that day. As the nation debated systemic failure and racial profiling, he was reminded that his role wasn't just to fight for one man, but to reform the machine that made such injustice routine. There are too many, Victor admitted, and for everyone that makes the news, there are thousands who don't. That's the problem. We respond when it's public, when it's personal. But justice shouldn't depend on proximity to power. Walter leaned back in his chair, eyes searching his son's face. Then change it. It wasn't a demand. It was a charge, a legacy. In the weeks that followed, Victor launched a national task force focused on wrongful arrests and prosecutorial misconduct. He faced fierce opposition accusations of bias, of overstepping, of leveraging personal experience for political gain. But for once, the headlines worked in his favor. Attorney General acts. After father's wrongful arrest carried a truth no one could ignore: the system had to answer for what it had become. Walter, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a movement he never sought. Letters poured in, some from strangers, thanking him for standing strong, others from families who had lost loved ones to similar injustices. He read every one, each story etched into his memory, each name a reminder that his experience was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. He began speaking at churches, community forums, even universities, places where people gathered not just to hear what happened, but to understand it. He told his story not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because if his suffering could spark reflection, if it could turn silence into action, then maybe it meant something more. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about whether Walter had stolen anything. It was about how quickly the world assumed he had. He never returned to Mike's Market. The idea of walking those aisles again brought a bitter taste to his mouth. But he wrote a letter to the store's owner, not out of anger, but out of necessity. He asked him to reconsider his silence, to think about the weight of a moment when a single word she didn't do, it could have changed everything. The letter ended simply: "Truth doesn't require courage, just decency." By the end of the year, the arresting officer had resigned. The prosecutor who lied about the footage faced disciplinary review. And Judge Ellison announced his retirement, his final statement acknowledging that justice delayed or delivered only under pressure is no justice at all. Walter didn't celebrate. He sat quietly as the news unfolded, watching the world move one step at a time toward something better. Not perfect, but better. And that's what justice should be. Not a weapon of the powerful, not a favor for the connected, but a right, equal, unconditional, human. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter turned to Victor, who stood on the porch watching the orange sky fade to dusk. "You did good, son," he said softly. Victor nodded, eyes moist. "We're just getting started." Because justice didn't end with Walter's release, it began there. Walter Bennett's story is not just a tale of mistaken identity. It is a mirror reflecting a truth many are too afraid to face, that in today's world, justice is not always blind. It often looks straight through the powerless. What began as a quiet morning errand for milk and bread turned into a public unraveling of a broken system. A 72-year-old black man, falsely accused, humiliated, handcuffed, and dragged through the machinery of law, became the center of a national reckoning, not because the truth prevailed swiftly, but because his son, Victor Bennett, the United States Attorney General, had the power to tilt the scale. What happened in that grocery store was more than a racial profile. It was a systemic failure. Walter wasn't treated like a citizen. He was treated like a suspect, judged not by actions, but by assumptions. And even when the truth was accessible, the footage that could have exonerated him within minutes, it was buried, ignored, denied, until power forced it to the surface. And yet Walter's response was not vengeance, but reflection. He didn't use the spotlight to rage. He used it to teach, to question, to open a dialogue we can no longer afford to ignore. He stood not only for himself, but for the countless others who wouldn't have had a Victor to call. He reminded us all that privilege, even when used for good, does not equal justice. Real justice must be available to everyone, not just those with titles, status, or connections. Victor, too, faced his own reckoning. His father's arrest stripped away the protective layers of his office and reminded him that no badge or title can shield his family or his community from systemic bias. In that courtroom, he wasn't the Attorney General. He was a son trying to protect the man who had once protected him. And in that moment, he chose to turn personal pain into public action, launching reforms aimed at exposing and correcting patterns of racial discrimination and prosecutorial misconduct. So what is the lesson here? It is that silence enables injustice, that assumptions kill credibility, and that systemic change doesn't begin in courtrooms or Capitol buildings. It begins with everyday citizens who are willing to speak question and demand better. This story challenges us all to consider how we view others, how quickly we judge, and whether we are willing to speak up when silence is easier. It asks us to examine our systems, our institutions, and most importantly, our values. In your own life, ask if you saw a Walter Bennett being falsely accused. Would you speak up? Would you be the Mike who said nothing, or the Victor who risked everything? Because justice requires more than good laws. It requires brave people. If Walter's story moved you, if it made you reflect on what justice should look like, don't let it stop here. Share this story. Talk about it with your friends, your family, your community. Use it as a spark to ignite bigger conversations. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you want to hear more untold truths, voices that challenge, uplift, and inspire, then please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that shines a light on the realities too often ignored. Together, let's keep the conversation alive and push for the kind of justice that doesn't depend on who you know, but who you are. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.